Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 quick match gameplay. This time around I'm playing as the Wood Elves against the Skaven led by Captain Falcon on the map Oasis of False Hope. And this time around we are running a very magic damage anti-light oriented build as we are of course going against Skaven. Of course, because I don't exactly know what the meta or what the useful strats are. We'll see how things go, and yeah, we'll just see how things break down. So right off the bat, of course, you can see that my lord is Orion, and why Orion? Well, Orion does cost terror, which is and is cheap. The new changes to the dragons, dragon mounts, have made dragon-mounted lords very, very expensive for what they are. And the Wood Elf dragons do not have very good armor. They only have 50 armor. So in general, I'm not the biggest fan of that, and despite the fact that they have breath attacks, and of course the lady is still very good, especially with Prayer Anathrema, I decided to go with Orion. Now Orion has been changed quite a bit. He has lost his charges, or sorry, he has lost his endless cast on Hounds of Orion and Hawk's Talons. Now those are limited charges, but I do believe they do a little bit more damage than they used to, or it definitely feels that way. Foe Seeker, of course, he still has, and most importantly, he does have Cloak of Isha, which gives him some built-in regen and survivability. Replenishment is much harder to come by in this Total War Warhammer 2 or in Mortal Empires, because potions have basically been removed. They're still available, but potions of either health or toughness are no longer really available, as far as I can tell, and that means that your lords and heroes generally don't have any sort of built-in self-sustain. So this is a very nice thing on Orion. Now I did cram in a Branch Wraith in here, but the Branch Wraith did get nerfed in some ways. It's much more expensive is the key difference, but it has gained 30 armor, which is very nice. It is still susceptible to fire damage, of course, but it does have some very nice buffs. Call of the Woods has been nerfed. Most AoE buffs of this sort, or debuffs of this sort, have been nerfed a bit. It not only does +5 melee attack rather than +8, but that is still a decent buff. Especially given that most of your units have in this last patch been given a slight buff to their stats, especially Dryads, which I'm feeling a lot of here. Then of course, for spells, I'm bringing Earthblood, which is a crazy good heal, despite its nerfs. Melkosmos Defying Miasma, which is a nice, decent damage, as well as slow debuff, which is nice against Skaven infantry, which often tends to have physical resistance and be pretty quick on his feet. And then finally, the other Trickster's Shard, and this is a very cool new item. Generally, items have been reworked, as I mentioned before. We lost potions, we lost scrolls for most part, but we did get access to some new items such as this, the other Trickster's Shard, which debuffs enemies' magic resistance around you. Now this might seem like a pretty stupid thing to pick, especially given that I didn't bring any magic attacks, but most of my damage in this Wood Elf army is magical. The Dryads, the Treekin, the Glade Guard with Hagbane tips, all of them do magical damage, so this will actually be a very significant buff. It means all of them are doing plus 22% damage, and against lightly armored Skaven, that could be a huge deal. That could just mean that they get annihilated just that much quicker. For example, it would mean that the Dryads are doing about an extra, I don't know how it's rounded exactly, about an extra 6 to 7 points of damage, depending on how it's rounded. And then for my front line, I'm running a front line of Dryads. Dryads did get a massive buff this last patch. Obviously, outside of the HP buff, which every unit in this game basically got an HP buff in this past patch, Dryads now have 60 instead of 30 armor. They also cause fear, which is very nice against Skaven, who have issues with that. They have built-in physical resistance. Most Skaven damage is physical, so this will be very nice. Immunity to psychology, which means terror bombs are not going to work from, say, doom wheels. And they just are very damaging unit to lightly or targets. Behind them, I do have a unit of Treekin just to stiffen up the front line a little bit. And behind that, 4 units of Glade Guard with Hagbane tips. Now, why Hagbane tips? Well, for one, it provides a debuff, which should make enemies a little easier to catch because it slows them down. But for 2, the ammunition is magical, which once again bypasses Skaven physical resistance. With the exception of Storm Vermin and Doom Wheels, the biggest source of Skaven survivability is physical resistance, by far, on Gutter Runners, Death Runners, and Plague Monks. Then finally, Wild Riders with shields. Shields because Skaven can bring a lot of shooting, actually, so I definitely don't want to get caught by that and destroyed. So my opponent went very wide, and I'm going to throw things into slow-mo, but there will be some action very, very early on. As of course, these Gutter Runners are fairly close to my army, so they're going to start peppering me, and I'm not going to like that, so I'm going to sally out with the Wild Riders. We both went very wide in this game, actually. My opponent has a very tight front line here, a mix of Plague Monks, and clan rats with shields. These guys should trade pretty effectively with, say, Eternal Guard, just because they're dirt cheap and they do a lot of damage to infantry models. However, against the dryads who bypass the physical resistance on the plague monks, for example, and do a lot of damage of their own, this definitely might not be as good. Behind that, my opponent does have, of course, a Plague Priest as a spellcaster, and the Plague Priest is a very solid lord, or hero option, I suppose. My opponent's lord is somewhere in here, Queek Head Taker, right here at the front line. Queek, of course, does have, did not actually, I don't believe he brought his Warpstone armor, which means he's not going to be debuffing my armor, which is nice. But he has Trophy Heads, and he has Dwarf Gouger, which means it makes him a very potent one-to-one lord, or hero hunter. Behind that is Plague Priest, who did bring, Pestilent Birth, I do believe. Actually, maybe not. He did. He brought Vermintide, okay, which of course lets him summon clan rats. He brought Pestilent Breath, which gives him a breath attack, which is actually will do probably a decent amount of damage to elf units, which have very low armor, and a Plague, which is a vortex. I'm not entirely sure how good Plague is. Vortex spells are generally not very good just because they wander around. But of course, he does have a leadership debuff when he hits. He does have armor-piercing damage. The Plague Priest is no pushover really. Behind that, a firing line composed of Skaven Slave Slingers. These guys are dirt cheap, only 200 apiece, so this is a very cheaper line than a single unit of my Glade Guard, and they can do a lot of damage. You can see the first catapult shots are going into my Dryads, and my archers are starting to pepper these Gutter Runners. Now, Warp Fire Thrower, a bit of an interesting pick, but it does do fire and magical damage, as well as a morale debuff, which could potentially be devastating against both my Treekin and my Dryads. And honestly, it would probably be devastating even to Eternal Guard, simply because it's so powerful against lightly armored targets. However, it's very lightly armored itself, which means that if I start shooting it, it's going to get annihilated very quickly. In the back, a Plague Claw Catapult, which is going to force me to come to my opponent, and that is escorted by Skaven Slave Spears. My opponent's front line is a mix of Gutter Runner Slingers, who are zoning out of here. Bit of an interesting choice, I think, given that they are, of course, catchable by Wild Riders, despite their net debuff. They have an AoE slow debuff, but they're going to be pretty bad at damaging Dryads, and not that great at exchanging fire with Elven Archers, because Elven Archers, of course, have much longer range and magical damage. That is one of those little niche things that definitely helps, in my opinion, the Wood Elves. On the very wide flanks, my opponent has Death Runners. I'm not entirely sure why he put them quite this far out, but these guys, of course, have Weeping Blade, Armor Piercing, and all those goodies. So if they get on top of me, they will debuff my armor and start doing some nasty damage. Now, unfortunately, I'm a bit of a micro mistake here. I accidentally clicked for my Wild Riders to go out here, and I'm actually not entirely sure where I ordered them, but they started pulling away, which means that these annoying Gutter Runners get a few free shots in. And now my Wild Riders have started catching up to these Gutter Runner Slingers with the help of a little bit of slows from the poison from the Hagbanes, and are now able to get on top of them. Now, unfortunately, the Plague Claw Catapult, although it's missing right now, does have a morale debuff, so it's going to help my opponent break my units as well, which could definitely be a bit of a nuisance. Meantime, these Gutter Runners are definitely losing models. They're losing quite a bit of HP. And I do disengage because I no longer want I don't want my Wild Riders getting tangled up here and be getting in trouble. My Dryads are being debuffed by that slow, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to start hitting these guys, and with their minimal armor and irrelevant physical resistance, they are in deep trouble. Now, my Glade Guard, in the meantime, are firing untargeted, which is a bit of a problem. And you can see they're boxed up, which is going to make them very susceptible to those hits from the Plague Claw Catapult. Very big mistake there on my part. Once I was ready to fire, I should definitely spread them out. Out here on the flank, my Wild Riders are chasing off these Gutter Runner Slingers. And shortly I'm going to be able to retarget my Hagbanes, but for now we're simply casting bombardments. You can see the hounds over there wandering off, and I'm throwing Orion straight into the heart of the battle here, trying to break these guys with his terror. The Dryads, as you can see, are performing very well against the Plague Monks, especially with the backing of the Branch Wraith, and the Clan Rats have already broken. The Gunner Restorer Slingers are on the run, and these Dryads over here are just swamping these poor Clan Rats with shields. In the meantime, in the back, the Wild Riders have done a very good job, and you can see the Hagbanes are tearing through the Warp Fire Throwers, who have very little survivability. Unfortunately, someone unit of Clan Rats is getting on top of my Glade Guard with Hagbanes, and one of my units has, of course, routed from the fire from the poison. Over here, you can see the Vortex spell actually does go down, Plague, which I do think is a bit of a mistake, though it did work out here, and it looks like a spell that either doesn't wander at all or wanders very, very little. So it might not be that bad. But unfortunately, it's not breaking my Dryads that quickly, and they stick around. And Dryads with their decent armor now are definitely a pretty tanky choice. They can definitely kind of sit through that. Over here, the Gutter Runners, I do believe these are the Gutter Runners, have recouped, and but I'm going to largely ignore them and start collapsing on my opponent, trying to collapse to the left and surround his troops. My Dryads over here are basically as good as dead. They're going to get caught by the Gutter Runners, but that's okay. They've already done an okay job. The Wild Riders here have caught with these Clan Rats, and actually the summoned Clan Rats can break, which is definitely a good thing for me. Previously, I'm pretty sure summoned units could not break. In the meantime, these poor Hagbane tips, because they're so clumped up, are getting torn apart. But they're trying to snipe down this Plague Claw Catapult, which has been a nuisance. And you can see my Dryads are collapsing onto my opponent. Over here, Orion is slugging it out with Skaven Slave Spears, just trying to disrupt all his shooting and tear out as much as he can. And these Dryads are doing an absolute champion job there. I do cast an Earthblood overcast on these guys just to heal them up a bit before they engage. And these guys are still at a decent model count. Nothing impressive, but decent. Over here you can see I throw my Dryads into the Death Runners. Once again, Death Runners are very low armor, very high physical resistance at 30%. So the Dryads will be able to slow them down just a little bit, but provide me with a bit of a speed bump until the Branch Wraith gets into position. In the meantime, this unit of Death Runners over here is coming out of the woodworks, pursuing some of my units, annoying some of my Hagbanes. But largely, it's not too much of a problem. They are, however, going to catch my Wild Riders with shields, I do believe, or maybe they're going to crash into each other pretty shortly. Over here, the Branch Wraith, I'm casting Melkot's Mystifying Miasma on these Death Runners, trying to weaken them up and make them a little less capable of catching my Hagbanes. Because, of course, Hagbanes right now do have 36 speed. I do, so with some debuffs hitting these guys, they have a decent chance of keeping away for a little bit at least. My opponent actually gives up the chase with the Death Runners. Now you can see these there. Once again, I'm throwing individual units of Dryads into the fray. Over here you can see Orion is getting swamped by a mix of Clan Rats as well as Queek Headtaker, who are just beating him down very, very quickly. Orion does not have very good melee defense, even though he's a pretty decent offensive lord. So someone like Queek with the back of these Clan Rats will actually probably tear through him pretty quickly because his armor is very bad and so is his melee defense. Though, of course, Cloak of Isha has popped, which gives him a massive amount of tankiness. So now I'm running away with Orion. I do not want to be losing him, so I'm just trying to get away, trying to get into these Death Runners, and hopefully disrupt them a little bit, maybe tear out them, and help my Wild Riders break them before bailing out with Orion entirely. However, my opponent has started to lose this sort of flank completely. All these units are routing. And because of that, my Glade Guard with Hagbane tips are able to start setting up and start peppering down all of his troops here. Unfortunately, Orion once again is forced to flee for his life, though these Death Runners are going to get broken. Another summoned unit of Clan Rats, definitely a bit of a nuisance, but not the end of the world. Orion can just juke back, and he is a very quick lord on his feet. The Skaven don't really have an option fast enough to catch him, especially not when they're being poisoned by Hagbanes. In the meantime, the rest of my opponent's army is essentially collapsing. Morale-wise, you can see my Dryads are coming back a bit. You can see some of my Glade Guard with Hagbane tips are over there, and I'm moving my Wild Rider, juggling them all over the place, just trying to bounce around between enemy units, and constantly debuff them. In the meantime, these units over here are kind of collapsing. You can see there's definitely being a bit of a rout over here. Death Runners are struggling. You can see another cast of vile, whatever it is. It's the breath attack of the poisonous breath, pestilent breath, goes down. But you can see in the meantime, Queek, the Plague Priest, and the rest of these clans are being surrounded and massacred by Wild Riders, the Branch Wraith, and Dryads. And the Glade Guard are now trying to break the Skaven Slaves, while Orion, of course, darts into them and just smashes them apart. So that's why my opponent's army is definitely starting to fall apart. The Wild Riders dancing around is definitely being a bit of a nuisance because they're simply too fast for him to catch, and they're causing fear, which is a huge problem for Skaven, who of course don't have much psychological immunity. Over here, Orion is regenning. Cloak of Isha gives him a very decent regen, and the game is a Pyrrhic victory. Now, I'm not entirely sure. I think this composition would be good against the majority of Skaven builds. I'm pretty sure it would be decent against, say, mass Rat Ogres, simply because the Dryads have immunity to psychology, and or the mix of Rat Ogres and Doom Mules, because you could stop the Doom Mules with your Treekin and your Wild Riders, and hopefully hold them in place and have Orion Branch Wraith beat on them. And the Dryads should perform pretty well, in my opinion, against the Skaven Slaves that usually escort them. And the Glade Guard should be able to tear through most units, even though they don't have armor piercing, simply through focus fire. Now, and against this sort of mobbish army, or for example a cheese strat, these guys should perform pretty well just because the Dryads do have decent armor if they're not being hit by Death Runners. And you do have a lot of magical damage here, and magical damage is absolutely critical against most of these Glass Cannon Skaven units, who are otherwise shockingly survivable. You will find that if you simply try to slug it out with, say, Death Runners, or Gutter Runners, or Night Runners, or even Plague Monks, they will tank a lot more than you would expect, simply because they have built-in resistances. You can see the kill count here is definitely pretty solid. The poor Glade Guard definitely got disrupted a decent amount, but they did shoot the Flamers up. They definitely caused some annoying damage to the units that had physical resistance and all that sort of stuff. Now, Wild Riders, of course, champion unit as always. They cause fear. They cause They can rampage around in the back line, disrupt your enemy as much as possible. I think the branch wraith is still very strong. It's much tankier than it, or a bit tankier than it was, and it still brings those good utility spells to the field. Plus, it has that AOE spell damage debuff, so definitely keep that in mind. Orion, of course, being an unbreakable lord who causes terror, despite his bombardment nerfs, is still a very solid lord. The losses you can see were definitely heavy on both sides. I lost about half my army. My opponent, or a little more than half my army. My opponent lost about 2/3. So, it was definitely a game I could have won if it had come down to straight up slaughter. But definitely very bloody on both sides. But yeah, I do hope this kind of demonstrated some Wood Elf strategies. One of the biggest problems right now for Wood Elves in the quick match meta in the quick match ladder is High Elves. So I'm trying to get a video of High Elf on Wood Elf, because that is probably the worst matchup in the game. That might be the worst matchup in the game right now, as far as I can think. Simply because High Elves have basically all the cards, and Wood Elves have very little going for them in that matchup. That said, I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was informative or fun to watch. If you have any comments, criticism, and if you have any comments, criticism, anything like that, any requests for units you'd like to see demonstrated or questions, be sure to post those down in the comments, and I will respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching. If you liked it, hit a sub and subscribe. Hit sub down below. Hit like and subscribe down below, and I will see you on the next one. Wyvern out.